Greetings, everybody. Thersites the Historian here. Normally, when we think about Switzerland in World War II, our minds immediately go to the idea that the Swiss were the bankers of the Nazis. However, reality was a great deal more complex than that, and that's really what I want to get into today when we look at the role that Switzerland played in World War II as a whole. As is always the case with all things historical, context is king. So let's look at the context of Swiss politics leading up to World War II. Since World War II is the natural outgrowth of World War I, it's natural to start there. Switzerland remained neutral in that conflict. They did have a role, however. Just because they were neutral does not mean that they were uninvolved. They were the country which hosted Vladimir Lenin up until 1917, when he famously made his train ride across Germany and went to Russia, where he helped to foment the Russian Revolution. Now, after the war, Switzerland got back involved with international politics. They joined the League of Nations in 1920. However, when they joined, they did not join up with a military obligation to the League, thus showing that Switzerland as a whole had a firm commitment to not intervening militarily in the conflicts of their neighbors. Now, during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, there was a lot of domestic problems in pretty much every country in Europe as well as in America. And what that led to was the popularization of movements like the Nazis and the Communists. So the Swiss government really heavily cracked down on both of those things in the 30s. And yes, the Nazis were a problem in Switzerland. I think we'll come back to that point in a minute. Now, after Hitler repudiated the Geneva Convention in 1935, Switzerland began to see the writing on the wall with regard to Hitler, and they greatly increased their own military spending just as a deterrent, and they began to start thinking about how to defend themselves if and when Hitler decided to invade. In 1937, they received an assurance from Hitler about him respecting their neutrality. This is after he had invaded some of his neighbors. And again in 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, he once again met with the Swiss and told them that he had no intentions of attacking them. However, the Nazis thought that this neutrality should come at a price, and one of the things they wanted was for Swiss newspapers to stop running hit pieces on the Nazi Party, Hitler, and Germany more broadly. So the Swiss government cracked down on freedom of the press and made sure that there weren't too many anti-German articles being published. As I noted before, Switzerland had decided that Germany was the greatest geopolitical threat to its existence in 1935 or so, and they had begun to build up their military. So the question then becomes, who was actually going to lead this military? Well, that man would be Henri Guisan. He was born in 1874, so he was an old man by World War II. He had been a professional artillery officer, and he had held the rank of colonel since 1920. Colonel doesn't sound like that high of a rank, but remember, Switzerland is a small country, and there really aren't that many positions available in the Swiss army, so it was actually one of the higher ranks. Now, during the pre-war period, he was a member of a party that was very Nazi-esque, so very right-wing and very nationalist. However, it's worth pointing out that every right-wing nationalist/fascist party at this time really glorified the nation that it was based in, and there was no real unity between, say, fascists in one country and fascists in another. That was only something which was created by the outbreak of World War II, for all practical intents and purposes. Guisan was elected general on August 28, 1939, and despite the fact that he has these nationalist leanings, he did see Germany as the biggest threat, especially when they had already annexed some of their neighbors, and of course just 2 or 3 days after he becomes Switzerland's general-in-chief, Germany invaded Poland. Now, he made plans to coordinate with France in case the Swiss were going to get involved. However, as it turns out, the Swiss actually did not get involved when the Germans invaded France. However, those plans were discovered by the Germans when they conquered France, and that created a bit of diplomatic tension between the two and made the Swiss feel like war was that much more inevitable. Most politicians in Switzerland were pushing for complete neutrality, and they were more or less willing to follow a strategy of appeasement in order to keep Switzerland out of war. But Guisan argued that the only way to keep Switzerland safe was to make active preparations for resistance. And we're going to talk about his strategy, which was ultimately implemented during the war period. As Guisan geared up to lead a potential resistance against a German invasion, he knew that one thing that he'd have to have is the support of his officer corps in the event of an invasion. As I just said, many politicians in Switzerland wanted to pursue a strategy of appeasement, and they might be likely to call for a surrender in the event of actual hostilities. Guisan, however, met with his men at Rütli Meadow. This was a site of great importance to the Swiss people. This is where the federal charter in 1291 was signed, and this is what made Switzerland a nation. So this is a place really loaded with symbolic meaning for all these patriotic Swiss officers. So what he did is he met with them here. He laid out his strategy, which we'll talk about, called the Redoubt Plan. And after hearing it, the officers were convinced that it was a pretty solid plan, and they all swore an oath to never surrender Switzerland. And this is actually a picture of that meeting. You can see the Alps in the background. It's a pretty beautiful place. So if you're going to take an oath to die, seems like as good a place as any, I suppose. When one compares the relative strength of Switzerland with that of Germany, it's not a very encouraging picture if you're on the Swiss side. However, the Swiss did have one very big thing going for them, and that is the presence of the Alps. The Alps are what really enable the Redoubt Plan, and ultimately they were the obstacle which helped to deter Hitler from launching an invasion. Now, the thing about the Alps is there are a lot of mountain passes, but all of these passes are pretty easy to fortify and garrison. And of course, this is naturally step one of any kind of plan to defend Switzerland. Guisan had some elite ski units at his disposal, and he stationed them at these fortresses in these passes. One thing to keep in mind is that most areas in the Alps are not ideal farmland because the terrain is obviously rugged, and altitude also makes it harder to grow crops. While the northern Alps are not as imposing, the ones facing Germany, unfortunately for him, they are still something that you can use as a method to delay. However, the southern Alps are very imposing. Famously, Hannibal lost a large percentage of his army crossing the southern Alps, and time really hasn't changed the formidability of the Alps that much. And this whole Redoubt Plan really relies upon the formidability of the southern Alps. So let's see what that plan entails. And now we see the confluence of an oath to fight to the death and how the Alps play a role. So the Redoubt Plan is just to retreat to the most defensible area of the Alps, where provisions have already been stored up, and to resist to the bitter end in order to really both deter Germany and to make them pay for any potential aggression. So basically, these mountain fortresses will have underground storerooms that the Germans can't easily bomb or infiltrate, which will enable the Swiss to hold out for years and really create problems. This plan is pretty radical. It calls for the abandonment of half of the Swiss territory, which would include all of the major Swiss cities, any one that you could name, and 3/4 of the population. So this is a very draconian strategy, and it shows the level of desperation on the part of Guisan and others who were determined to resist the Germans at all costs. To make sure that these provisions could be stored and all these fortresses could be readied, what would happen is you had an army of 100,000 men in the north to hold the northern Alps just long enough for the line in the south to really be finalized, and then presumably the survivors from the north would try to make their way south. Obviously, this plan was never tested, but you can imagine that this would have been a major headache if you were Germany and Italy and you thought that you were going to be able to steamroll Switzerland. While Hitler tried to always reassure the Swiss that they had nothing to fear from him so long as they cooperated, The truth is, Hitler wanted to eliminate Switzerland. They were a low priority target, but he still had every intention of destroying them. Hitler hated the Swiss, and he saw their state as an anachronism. The operation which would have invaded Switzerland was called Operation Tannenbaum. This is something that was planned between the summer of 1940 and October of that year. The invasion called for 11 German divisions and 15 Italian divisions, which would have been a lot more than what the Swiss army could field. The basic idea was to draw the Swiss army out and then cut it off before it could really take refuge in the mountains. I'm not sure how aware the Germans were of the Redoubt Plan, but I have to imagine that after a certain amount of time they were wise to it. You don't build mountain fortresses and involve a lot of laborers in that way without drawing some attention. And we'll see that Switzerland was a hotbed for spies. Now, when Guisan made his speech in 1940, this made all of the planners fear heavy losses, which I imagine has a lot to do with why the Germans wanted 15 Italian divisions to go in against the Southern Alps and, absorb a lot of those losses. Despite the fact that this plan was effectively impossible because Germany and Italy were too committed on other fronts from about 1941 onward, this plan was officially in the works up until D-Day. So June 6, 1944 is only when this plan was officially put on hold. In many ways, that just speaks to the level of delusion on the part of Hitler, who really was very overconfident in the ability of himself and his armies to accomplish impossible tasks. This then leads to the rather complicated question of how were Swiss relations with the Allies? And the answer is that those relations were pretty complex. The Allies launched a lot of formal protest about Switzerland trading with Germany, and because Switzerland was landlocked by fascist powers after the successful invasion of France, their trade with the Germans had tripled by 1942. So Switzerland was economically locked in with Germany and Hitler's European Empire. Now, the Germans did allow some trade concessions so that the Swiss could trade with the British in order to secure crucial supplies like copper, rubber, nickel, etc. However, for the most part, the Germans restricted what the Swiss did economically, and they more or less controlled Switzerland's imports and exports. Switzerland did export some things to the West. They were able to export machine tools and typewriters to America. And throughout the war, Swiss typewriters were available at stores in New York. However, Swiss trade policy was adjusted accordingly depending on the way that the tide was going in the war. A famous Swiss adage from the time sort of sums up the Swiss attitude, which was 6 days a week we work for the Germans, on the 7th day we pray for the Allies. Sentimentally, the Swiss wish they could be with the Allies and they wish they could do more. However, they weren't willing to risk war when they knew that they had no real chance of winning against the vastly superior military power of the Germans. We've now seen what Switzerland's grand strategy was during the war, so let's talk about how they went about implementing that strategy. In September of 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, the Swiss fully mobilized their military. This meant that 4.2 million men were under arms, which is more than 1 in 10 citizens who served in the army. In addition, about 500,000 men served as volunteer auxiliaries, and they did things like drive ambulances, work on aircraft, run supplies, etc. Just all the little tasks you need to keep an army in the field and to keep men supplied at the front. This is actually the highest percentage of the male population under arms, which I personally find very surprising, given that Switzerland didn't actually get formally involved in the war. Switzerland had for a long time given boys training with rifles from a very young age to make sure they were proficient. The system going into the war was that you trained until age 20, and then you had a 3-month basic training, and you took an annual 3-refresher course until you were age 48, and then there was an inactive reserve of men ages 48 to 60. So that's how they were able to field a relatively large army even with a small population. The potential exigencies of a war with Germany, however, forced Switzerland to really intensify its training methods going into the war period. So basic training was extended to 4 months to make men more proficient and better able to conduct themselves in combat. Obviously, if you're going to fight Germany and Italy, they have a lot of combat veterans in their ranks, so the more training you can get, the better. The active age was extended from 19 to 60 rather than 20 to 48. One other thing that helps in a war is to have as many swinging dicks in the field as you can find, to borrow a phrase from one of my friends. Now, the drilling that they undertook increased in both intensity and frequency, so these men were being kept fresh and they were being held to a higher standard than they were accustomed to. There were a lot of men stationed on the frontier, especially the northern frontier of Germany, and it was very common for those men to trade insults with the Germans. They also apparently would trade items once in a while, and as we saw from the first slide, the intro slide, they would occasionally take pictures at the border. So this was not an entirely hostile relationship. However, anytime you have two forces across a border from each other, there will be some interaction. A lot of the things that they drilled to do were elements of the Redoubt Plan. So one thing that they trained a lot on was how to blow up their forts when their positions have been compromised. And they also trained at swimming across icy rivers. It takes quite a bit of discipline to swim in icy water because your body has a natural tendency to seize up. So this is actually something that would be worth training in and worth practicing in case you ever had to do it. So now let's really delve into some nitty-gritty detail stuff. Let's talk about the Swiss infantry. So Switzerland, despite being a small country, actually used weapons that they themselves manufactured. Their infantry weapons were pretty much on par with what both the Axis and the Allies were using, so this was not a major disadvantage. They had rifles, machine guns, and light machine guns, so basically the same types of things that the Americans or the Germans would have been able to field for their regular infantry units. They had a rifle called the K-31, and this was a bolt-action rifle. It's pictured on your screen. It was superior to the German K-98 because it was a newer design, so it probably was a little more accurate or more reliable. I'm not really enough of a firearms expert to know how one bolt-action rifle is really all that much different than another, but from what I read, it is better. They also had the MP-43-44. This had a 50-round magazine, and this would be comparable to something like the Thompson submachine gun or the German MP-40, except it can fire a lot more shots, and it was used by the Finnish in the Winter War of 1939. So that is how Swiss infantry were equipped, and those are some of the weapons they would have used had they engaged in a combat scenario with the Germans or the Italians. Now let's look at equipment that was for the rest of their military. Now, famously, World War II featured a lot of tanks. However, the Swiss army was not all that well equipped with tanks. They didn't really have very many tanks or tank destroyers, and that was an area of inadequacy that they were never able to address. The problem for the Swiss army is they needed vehicles which could operate on rough terrain and in confined spaces, and that's one of the reasons why they never really were able to go the tank route. But also, it probably wouldn't have been that important because it's hard to use tanks in the mountains. They were able to acquire a fair amount of equipment from the French. At least one French corps, rather than surrendering to the Germans, just crossed the Swiss border. They turned over all their equipment and they actually lived out the war in Switzerland. So this gave them an influx of new equipment. However, obviously, not enough to stop a German invasion. The other problem that they had is while they did have artillery and AA guns, which is something they always could have used more of, both of those things were outdated. So their artillery was probably 20 or 30 years behind, and it's unlikely that their AA was really adequate for shooting down a concerted air raid. we'll talk about some aerial activities over Switzerland. And when you think about the relatively low numbers of planes that went down despite Swiss efforts to shoot them down, you see that their AA guns really were not top notch by any stretch of the imagination. While Switzerland was never invaded by land, its airspace was violated. You could say that its airspace was more full of holes than Swiss cheese. Swiss airspace was violated 6,501 times by Axis and Allied aircraft. That's a pretty substantial number, and for the most part, Switzerland was not really able to do all that much about it. Especially later in the war when the British started flying bombers over at night from Italy. The Swiss had no way to counter this, and they didn't really have the technology to even detect these planes, so there wasn't much they could do about it. Now, because the British were using the lights from the Swiss cities to navigate, the Germans actually demanded that the Swiss do a blackout at night, so that way the Allies would have a lot more difficulty trying to navigate. This is, of course, when Germany is really suffering from the strategic bombing campaign, which was going on around the clock at this point. There were some bad incidents. On April 1st, 1944, the American Air Force, probably the 15th Air Force, dropped 400 bombs on a border town called Schaffhausen because they thought that it was the town they were ordered to bomb in Germany called Tuttlingen, which was about 21 miles away. And ultimately, the U.S. profusely apologized for this mix-up, and they paid $62 million in compensation. So, the blackout was somewhat effective if you're the Germans, because, the American bomber pilots had to guess which town was which, and they guessed wrong. While my previous comments on Swiss airspace and the state of the Swiss anti-aircraft artillery might lead you to think that Switzerland was completely defenseless in the air, that's actually not true. In 1940, the Swiss Air Force had 300 pilots and 210 planes, and that's not a lot, especially during the World War II period when you needed a lot of aircraft to have any real impact, but it's still a lot more than at least I suspected that they had at the time. During the course of the war, the Swiss actually did succeed in shooting down 11 Luftwaffe planes, and they also were able to force down or shoot down over 100 Allied planes, especially bombers, which were slow. Now, the Air Force, because of its small size and limited detection capabilities, was not able to make sorties against all violators, and they started a policy of only going up to meet flights of 3 or more and asking them to leave. Surprisingly, the primary fighter that Switzerland was able to employ during the war was the German Me-109, and they had 90 of these things operational in 1940. Later, when they made another deal with the Germans, they were able to purchase 12 additional fighters with upgraded engines and features. Despite the fact that Switzerland never actually got formally involved in the war, they did fight one battle. And this battle kind of emerged from the constant violation of Swiss airspace by Axis forces during the invasion of France in the summer of 1940. So basically the Germans were flying bombers over Switzerland to get to France, and the Swiss weren't having any of that. So when the Swiss detected 3 German HE-111 bombers pictured on the left, they shot them down. And they made no secret of the fact that they had done so. So Hermann Goering, after this, actually ordered fighter escorts to prevent that from happening again. But the Swiss were not deterred, and when 38 German fighters and bombers decided to violate Swiss airspace again, 14 Swiss Messerschmitt 109s flew up, and they had an involved air battle between, obviously this force of 38 versus this force of 14. And surprisingly, the Swiss more or less won this skirmish. 4 German aircraft went down, with only 1 Swiss aircraft being shot down. Now, this was a pretty embarrassing loss for the Germans, and Hitler was enraged, which I'll grant is not hard to do, and he openly threatened to invade over this incident. However, he had bigger fish to fry. He had to finish off France, and he had some problems with the British, And of course, about a year later, he decided to invade Russia. So, he had other stuff to do, but this was actually probably the closest point that Switzerland and Germany came to openly engaging in war. Because the Swiss often forced down bombers and shot down several aircraft over the course of the war, they actually did have a sizable number of POWs, despite the fact they weren't formally at war. Um, because so many American bombers were forced down, and because those bombers all had crews of 10 or 12, this meant that 1,700 Americans ended up being interned as prisoners of war in Switzerland. Some of them lucked out and they got to stay at alpine resorts. However, others were trapped in camps which were pretty miserable. One of these prison camps was called Wilmers. I probably did not pronounce that correctly at all, but we'll just call it W Camp. And it was run by a known Nazi sympathizer, and this created a lot of controversy. I believe there's a whole article about this online, so look it up if you want. And despite the abuses that American airmen did suffer in these camps, they were not formally classified as POWs until 2013. So, the Swiss government was very proactive in admitting that they made some mistakes. Just like in Portugal, which was also a neutral power, Switzerland was a hotbed for intrigue and espionage. The Swiss government had a great fear of sabotage and treason, which led them to ban the National Movement of Switzerland, which was basically their equivalent of the Nazi Party, and the Communist Party in November of 1940. Now, for the wartime, Switzerland actually reinstated the death penalty after banning it, and during the course of the war, 17 Swiss citizens were executed for treason. Switzerland had a very small group of men dedicated to fighting espionage. They only were 120 in number. However, they were very efficient and very effective. And in fact, of all the people who the Germans faced in World War II, they considered Swiss counterintelligence to be the best. Alan Dulles of the OSS, who was a very famous American figure in the CIA during the early Cold War, was based at Bern, and he would contact German and Italian dissidents and also speak with the French resistance from Bern. And of all of the involved powers in World War II had a presence in the city of Bern, with the exception of the Soviet Union. These are two pictures from Bern, which I believe are contemporary with the war period, although I am not 100% certain on that. While Switzerland was not nearly as well known a safe haven as, say, Portugal, it still did take in quite a few refugees during the war period. After the Germans occupied Austrian Sudetenland in the 30s, a lot of refugees came to Switzerland and either stayed there or went elsewhere. Now, during the war, Switzerland really locked down, so when people would come there, they were more or less stuck. As I briefly alluded to earlier, there were 30,000 French troops during the invasion of France who surrendered to the Swiss rather than being taken captive by the Germans. And those men pretty much all remained in Switzerland for the remainder of the war. When Vichy France actually declared 170,000 of its Jewish population to be undesirable, the Swiss agreed to allow in 7,000 Jews. And when some of the men who got there too late to be admitted began to commit suicide rather than being, shipped off to participate in the Holocaust, some of the Swiss officials on the ground were willing to look the other way while other people were admitted to the country. It's not exactly clear how many people got in this way, but it clearly was not all of the people who needed refuge. So Switzerland's role as a safe haven is a little controversial. They did a fair amount, but they definitely could have done more. And this is partly why Switzerland actually doesn't have that great of a reputation for its World War II role. However, to partially defend the Swiss, I think it's worth pointing out that the wartime economy in Switzerland was not the greatest. Now, obviously, the tourism industry was completely ruined by the war, and this led to, as I mentioned earlier, POWs being held in alpine resorts since they weren't being used for skiing. There were no tourists there to ski. In addition, Switzerland has mostly poor farmland, and its trade was very constricted, so it was very hard for the Swiss to feed their own population, much less take in more refugees and try to feed them as well. And the Swiss were suffering in other ways, such as lacking basic commodities like coal, heating oil, iron, and steel. And since Switzerland is mostly in the Alps, it gets pretty cold there, and a lot of people had to basically go cold during the winter because of these restrictions. Not to mention the nighttime blackout meant that at night you would really have to suffer more. They did manage to get limited supplies of things they needed from the British when the Germans would allow some trade concessions. However, life in Switzerland was not luxurious, and the place was far from a land of milk and honey during the war period. And now for Switzerland's most controversial and best known wartime practice, banking with the Nazis. So what would happen is when the Germans would loot Western Europe and other areas, they would acquire the national gold reserves of various countries like Belgium, and they would take that gold and exchange it for Swiss francs, which they would then use to buy things that they needed as a country. In addition, some Nazi officials would actually visit Switzerland, start accounts, and they would have unnumbered anonymous accounts that would be hard to trace and hard to shut down or confiscate. So during the course of the war, it's estimated that between $1 and $300 million worth of German gold, captured German gold, I should add, not just like German gold, went to Switzerland and was exchanged for Swiss currency. Switzerland, after the war, repaid $58 million to the national banks of Belgium and France, which of course had been raided by the Nazis. And there was another lawsuit in the year 2000 by the World Jewish Congress, who pointed out that by helping the Nazis with banking practices, that Switzerland had blood on its hands in regard to the Holocaust, since they helped the Nazis fund their war effort for all practical intents and purposes. This has led to a lasting stigma of the Swiss during World War II. However, I hope that in the course of this video, I've shown you that the situation was pretty complicated, and that even though what the Swiss did was not necessarily noble, it is understandable. They didn't really have a lot of options, and the options that they had were not very good. They were looking at possibly fighting to the death. They were going cold and hungry, and they really would have stood almost no chance in a straight up fight with the Germans or even the Italians. So that's pretty much all I've got to say on the issue of Switzerland during World War II. Thank you for watching Thersites the Historian. If you're interested in my content, please consider subscribing. I also have a PayPal link that you can check out if you'd like to help me produce more videos like this. In the near future, I'm going to have at least 3 more videos that are similar to this one. I'm going to be looking at Sweden, Ireland, and Turkey during World War II. They, of course, were also neutral powers. So if you liked what you saw here, there's going to be more of that. And I'm also doing other videos on different topics. I'm going to have my sequel to my video about Julian the Apostate. I'm doing a series on Japanese medieval history, so I'm going to be looking at Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu. And I'm also planning on doing a video on the famous Battle of Champions between Sparta and Argos in ancient Greece. So if any of those things interest you, please be on the lookout for them. So consider subscribing. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Good night and good luck.